Hello, this is Bill with my March update. In March I read 2.5 books. So the Three Musketeers that I started in February, I took almost half of March to finish it. So at the start of this book, D'Artagnan is acting sort of like an idiot. He easily gets offended and challenges people to duels, and then he always wins the duel, even against experienced soldiers. And then he offends the Three Musketeers, and they each challenge him to a duel. So he's about to start dueling with the first one, and if he survives, then he'll go on to the next musketeer, and then if he survives that, go to the third one. But when they just barely get started, they're interrupted by the Cardinal's soldiers, because dueling is illegal. So then they have to fight off the Cardinal's men instead of dueling. So after they defeat the Cardinal's men, then D'Artagnan becomes friends with the Three Musketeers. So throughout the book, the Three Musketeers often behave like idiots. So the book was sort of boring and slow going for the first 400 pages. So then, starting around page 400 to 600, it got more interesting, almost like it was written by a different author. Then I read the Hound of the Baskervilles and the Valley of Fear. So the Hound of the Baskervilles was probably the best Sherlock Holmes story I've read. It's a little bit of gothic horror. So the atmosphere makes a lot more story, or a lot better story, and since it's a novel, it's more involved than his short stories. And the Valley of Fear, which is also a novel, is fairly interesting. So the Valley of Fear, the first part, is a murder investigation in London, and the second part is what took place in America previously, which led up to the murder in England. So the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes and His Last Bow are short stories. So his later stories, which in some ways are more interesting than his early stories. They're longer and darker. So the stories, he starts using a telephone, which he didn't have in the earlier stories. And then in the last story, which is leading up to World War I, where the German spy in England is buying plans for British military capabilities. In that story, there's automobiles, which is probably the only Sherlock Holmes story with automobiles. So I have these two Sherlock Holmes books, which I was reading before, but they don't have the Valley of Fear and his last battle, so that's why I got these two books. So the only Sherlock Holmes that I haven't read so far is Return of Sherlock Holmes. This book is formatted like a regular book. There's no illustrations except for the title page for each book. Whereas this book has a lot of illustrations. And it's formatted like it was in the Strand magazine. Then for my book haul during the month, I got Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse, The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, and Dune, the Duke of Caladan by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson. So this is a first in a new trilogy. That's the third book is probably not available yet. So currently I'm reading Century Reign by Alastair Reynolds. I just started this yesterday. So Century Reign is not just a time travel story, nor a tale of alternate history. Part hard sci-fi thriller, part interstellar adventure, part noir romance. Century Reign is something altogether stranger. And I'm also reading Dante, the Divine Comedy, that I read one canto per day. They're usually about 4 or 5 pages. So I'm on canto 10. So then what should I read next? So maybe I'll read some magazines. So there's Minotaur in a Mushroom Maze by Richard and Nancy Carrigan, which I remember reading in 1976 and enjoying it, but I don't remember much about the story. So that's serialized over 3 magazines. So the cover artist is Kelly Ferez, which he tends to make the more interesting covers. And he also illustrated the story. The other story I would like to read is Shadrach in the Furnace by Robert Silverberg. I don't know if I read that one before or not, but when I was first subscribing to Analog, I was pretty well reading every issue. And here's some other books I would like to read. So 3 of these Michael K. Vaughan had in his Hall of Adventure video. So Larry Niven, A World Out of Time. A Long Way Home by Poul Anderson. Collision Course by Robert Silverberg. And then there's Star Colony by Keith Laumer, which Fred from Read by Fred noticed lurking in my background. I'd also like to read Stainless Steel Rat sometime by Harry Harrison. And then there's the 4 Lords of the Diamond by Jack L. Chalker that I read back in the 80s, and all I remember is that I enjoyed it quite a bit, so I need to reread it to remind myself what it was about. Lilith, A Snake in the Grass. Cerberus, a wolf in the fold. Sharon, a dragon at the gate. Medusa, a tiger by the tail. So I probably won't get around to reading most of these. But probably just finish Century Reign and get on to the magazines. That maybe I just will read these two stories. Instead of reading the complete magazines. But I could always read some of these other books instead of the magazines. So that's all for now. See you in the next video.